Yeah, so welcome to the Conscious Life Expo 2025. We're going to give a bit of a talk about the Theraphi today and some related technologies. And yeah, so let's get right into it. My name is Paul Harris, and I basically consider myself a philosopher of nature, an electrician. I've spent my life studying energy technologies, and I have interest in healing technologies as well, both phytochemistry and herbology, mushrooms, as well as food production, because I think these are the three things that we need to focus on in order to make a more sustainable future. And we're going to give a presentation tonight on basically electromedical type systems, as well as energy systems and the future of where we're going with energy technologies. When I was a kid, my dream was to get a chemistry set, and every year for my birthday and Christmas and that, I'd ask my parents for a chemistry set, and they never got me one. It was my dream to understand chemistry and everything like that. They never got me one because they said, oh, well, you're just going to blow yourself up with a chemistry set, and we know that's dangerous. So instead, they got me an electronics kit, and this was an electronics kit that I got at a young age from Radio Shack, and that's basically where I got into electronics, and I started building lots of different circuits with this thing, and it came with this manual, and you could do 150 projects. You could build radio transmitters and receivers and all kinds of really neat stuff. So my dream then was to become a radio DJ and have my own pirate radio station, which I did very quickly after that. And every year for Christmas, I got some kind of other electronic communication tool, like this old walkie-talkie and things like that over the years. So I slowly built up my lab. I found some old pictures from many years ago, like 40 years ago, and I started working on all these kind of things. And nowadays, despite my parents calling to say, well, you're going to blow yourself up, I ended up collecting a lot of chemistry equipment over the years. So now I have a really wicked chemistry lab. And I first got into plasma side of things in the late 70s when these microwave ovens for home use came out. And I went over to my friend's place, and he said, yeah, it's really cool. It cooks your food and heats it up, and it's just electricity. There's no oven or anything in there. He said, the only thing you can't do is put metal inside of this thing. And so I said, well, what happens if you put metal in there? And he said, well, yeah, check it out. I'll show you. And so they had these glasses with a gold rim on there. And we put the glass inside the microwave, and this plasma appeared all around the glass, and it burnt the gold right off. Like, it was super intense and super hot. It can get so hot, and they would always say, oh, don't put metal in your microwave because it'll destroy your microwave. But what's happening in there, that's an RF plasma that's being created, and the temperatures in that plasma can reach in the tens of thousands of degrees. So you can quickly destroy your glasses and any metal or anything in there, and then eventually burn down the whole microwave because the plasma will etch right through the wall of the microwave and burn it out. So I was pretty fascinated by that. So that kind of got me into plasma and understanding what plasma really is. And there wasn't a lot of information about it in those days. But one thing that was popular around that time was the Curlian photography. So I started modifying old ignition coils from cars, and I could put 20,000 volts on a steel plate and put a piece of film on the thing, like from the old film cameras. You put your film on there, and you could put a leaf on there. And one thing they talked about was this phantom leaf effect, where you cut the piece of the leaf off and you could see the aura around the field. So I did my fingertips and stuff. I never had success with the phantom leaf effect. I did a few leaf cuttings and put them on there. But what's happening here is you're actually seeing the aura around your energetic field around your body, and you can expose, you can get different colors and everything like that, because as you provide the extra energy potential, it amplifies the natural plasma field that you have around your body. And this is how the Theraphi sort of works. It works with plasma and the bioenergetic field around your body. Some people call it aura, and some people can see in those things. And if you're really sensitive, you can make that out. So with the Kerlian photography, it kind of amplifies that. And then I got into Royal Raymond Rife and built a lot of different Rife machines when I was about 20 years old or so. I read the book by Barry Loynes called The Cancer Cure That Worked, and started building these Rife machines, which basically had a RF amplifier here that was used for shortwave radio and about 300 watts of power. So with this system, you could actually talk to like somebody in Japan from here, so it had that much power. And basically I would take CB radios and rip all the harmonic suppression out of it so you could drive really powerful waves into these plasma tubes. And a friend of mine was a glass blower. He still blows the glass for the Theraphi tubes today. He's one of the best glass blowers in North America, if not the world. And so I started putting this out and going to trade shows like this at a young age. And you know, back then people were really skeptical of a lot of these things. They would say things like, oh, the body has absolutely nothing to do with electricity, and that's just pseudoscience and all these things. But what Rife was doing was he was using the RF plasma to actually destroy viruses and bacteria, and he would culture them in petri dishes and inoculate rats, and did all kinds of experiments with that. And then around that time in the early 1900s, when he started showing this, the American Medical Association was just being formed, and they brought him 20 terminally ill cancer patients, and he cured them with using this technology. And he's a pretty amazing guy. So nobody had heard of him at this time. That book had kind of come out, and it was pretty obscure. And so we formed a group in Calgary and Vancouver and later in Edmonton with the Rife organization. We all got together and sort of accumulated all this Rife technology that started coming out of the woodwork. People were finding machines in their attic and all this stuff that was buried away. Did a lot of films and writing and stuff like that. And so I knew at a young age that the body, you know, there's much more to the body. We have this energetic potential, and how we can interface that with using electricity. So experimented a lot with different plasma tubes and different shapes, different types of plasmas contained in the tubes, and these are some examples on the bench. And of course, really powerful plasmas are formed in lightning, and there's enough power in one lightning strike to run an entire city for a year, probably more. It's just the problem is we can't capture that power and hold it and slowly release it. You would need we use a capacitor to do that. And if you hit anything with a bolt of lightning, it just annihilates it, it destroys it, as you know. And so that's sort of the dream, is to capture this lightning and keep that power contained in a jar, and then slowly utilize that power over time. Then we would have this amazing power source, because basically, the other thing people said around that time was like, oh, you know, the second law of thermodynamics, and then there's no such thing as free energy. That's all crazy stuff. You know, free energy doesn't exist, and, you know, and don't even bother looking for it. So, but I kind of had a pretty good feeling that just knowing everything in nature, everything, all matter and everything, this all comes from energy. Actually, it all comes from plasma. Plasma is like the first state of matter. We call it the fourth state of matter, but it goes in a cycle, and it's also the first state. So just like the lightning can disrupt things, rip it apart and destroy it, things are created again anew through plasma. So we basically live in an infinite sea of energy. All this is energy around us, and matter, E equals mc squares. You know, you can go back and forth between matter and energy, and it takes energy to keep this matter contained. But the reason why it's not free is because someone was smart enough to put an electric meter on your house and charge you for it. Now they have smart meters, and they can control all your appliances and monitor your vehicle and everything. But it really comes down to the fact that we live in an electric universe. And everything, all this matter is just waves upon waves upon waves that are embedded within each other. So when you get into the fundamental understanding of physics, chemistry, and biology, it's all about charge. And so one day I pictured this concept that we will have this infinite amount of energy that we will be able to carry around in a small box like this. And we're not far off. We're really close. Like, it most likely has existed for quite a while, because here at this conference everybody's talking about spaceships and UFOs, and how are those things running? You know, they're not filling up with gasoline to run those things. What they have on board to be able to maneuver and do all the crazy things they do, and you know, space travel and all that, is this tapping the zero point with one of these energy sources. So one day I picture we're all going to have like a little suitcase, and that's going to be the amount of energy that you consume for the rest of your life. The problem with that is putting that much power in everybody individual's hands. And this is all part of the conscious evolution of the planet and where we're at right now. The reason why we don't have that much power and it's not handed out to everybody is because somebody would do something stupid with it. Because if you had that much power, you could essentially annihilate an entire city or more. So we have to overcome this thing, and it's part of our evolution of consciousness, where, you know, if these other beings from you know, extraterrestrial beings and stuff are coming to Earth and observing us, they're watching very closely to see where we're at, and to get to the point where we have consciously evolved enough to basically stop killing each other and utilize this type of energy for good things. So that's what Theraphi is, basically, is a way, I call it a consciously assisted technology, because the plasma, as we're going to see, is an interface with consciousness itself. And basically what you do is you lay on this table in between these two tubes, and your body is sort of this non-linear dielectric medium that is basically like a capacitor. So it charges you up with the charge, and these plasma tubes are designed to provide this bioactive field around you, activated with frequencies, but primarily the principles behind it is to create this charge around your body that your body absorbs like a sponge. And it absorbs the light, the photonic emissions from the tube. There's also a magnetic component to it, like a electromagnetic field that's created by a large coil that's underneath the bed. And yeah, it's been 10 years now since we released this, way back. And yeah, and so originally, yeah, Dan Winters came to me and he said, you know, I have this formula for these frequencies based on phi ratio and the golden mean, and could you build some kind of gizmachi that we can test this bioactive field with? And I was like, oh yeah. So basically I spent a year and put all the different technologies that I'd worked on over this time into what became the Theraphi. And yeah, it provides a bioactive field that enables one to achieve this deep state of relaxation. And this relaxed state is what happens where you can do neat things like stabilize your flight or flight response, relaxes the vagus nerves, reduces cortisol levels, improves blood flow, and it just supports your body's natural healing tendencies. Relaxing the vagus nerve alone helps regulate digestion, gut function, modulating heart rate, blood pressure, influences the immune system, controls breathing and respiration, and interacting with the gut-brain health and all the microflora inside of you as well. And pets particularly are very sensitive to these types of energies, and they seem to know where the sweet spot in the field is because it's right in the center of those two tubes. And like this kitty here, he looks like he's getting ready to go into outer space, like the cat from outer space. And so now a lot of these type of technologies utilize the same principles that the Theraphi is. And what's happening now, and I'm starting to talk more about this, I haven't talked about it a lot over the years because people were back in the days, early days, 20, 30 years ago, they were totally non-receptive of it. Then when you started talking about extraterrestrials and UFOs and that, most people were like, oh, okay. But now we're getting to start hear all these stories about disclosure and all this kind of thing. So we're slowly getting ramped up, I believe, for this disclosure. The problem, and I've got this "don't be duped" here. What's happening is there's in the UFO arena has always been plagued by disinformation agents, because there's been people that want to keep you, all the same people that are coming out of the woodwork now, these are the same people that have been keeping the technology from everybody. Now they're saying, yeah, we want disclosure and all this. So there's a lot of funny business going on. So it's really important to be discerning in these matters. And the Tic Tac's a good example. This is one of the latest ones that's come on board. But actually that original video of the Tic Tac came out in like 2014 or something like that, was released on the internet. But here, you know, somebody inside the Tic Tac saying, we want to share our anti-gravity technology with the Earth. Think it will end greed and the war over oil. And the boys in the control room are like, but it'll destroy America's military-industrial complex and damage our careers. I mean, the national security. So there's a lot of controversy over this, and it'll be real interesting. And interesting to go back in time and think about Mork from Ork when he popped out of an egg, you know, and this sort of conditioning that happens in media and stuff like this. So how long have we known about these egg-type craft, and how, you know, how is it coincidence that these things happen? So you'll see this in a lot of things like Star Wars and Star Trek, and that they are preparing society as slowly with the media and things like that to get to the point where when we can understand and we'll accept it, we'll say, oh yeah, you can teleport. I remember that when I was a kid. I saw it on Star Trek, right? So what's really cool about this energy and technology that drives both the Theraphi and these type of technologies is it can be used for energy production. And you can actually convert matter from energy. You can make matter, manifest matter, and you can convert matter, straight solid matter, into energy. These craft can run on the system that does that, and really you would just put a piece of solid metal, your fuel, instead of having to go and fill up in the gas tank, you could have like a small chunk of an iron block that would be at the center core of your reactor, and there's enough energy that you can get out of that iron block to travel to Alpha Centauri and back, no problem. So material transmutation and manifestation, and of course field propulsion, or what everybody kind of knows as anti-gravity. And basically what the Theraphi is doing, this is also disclosure about Theraphi too, because I'm going to tell you things that I've never told anybody in public before. And basically what it's doing is creating these toroidal forms. It's all based on the toroid. The plasma tubes themselves are two counter-rotating plasma fields. One spins clockwise, the other spins counterclockwise. Just like you saw in Star Trek when they stepped onto the teleporter and they stepped on a little plasma spinning disc on the bottom and a plasma spinning disc on the top. And what's this doing is creating these charge clusters in the air. And these charge clusters are toroidal fields that fold in on themselves. So they're little microscopic to nanoscopic, and these can scale. They're scale invariant, they're fractal, they're recursive, and they fold in on themselves. And these charge clusters are what interact with the bioactive field around your body. So the Theraphi is basically twisting and causing a twist in the ether, what we call, what the Russians called actually spintronics. It's been called torsion fields. This idea of putting a twist into the ether to make this energy manifest more efficiently. And ultimately, we can use this to go all the way down to the subatomic level and actually tap 0 point with it. So, surprise, there's a whole lot more to Theraphi than just a healing device. But like I said earlier, the dangers in these technologies is it can be used for a powerful weapon, and these things have been, this technologies has been used for weapons, it's been used for spacecraft, propulsion, these kind of things, but there's also the amazing healing modalities to it, and that's what Theraphi is primarily designed to do. And so these are the tubes that everything gets interjected into these couplings on here, and this high voltage charge goes into the tubes, and one spins clockwise, the other spins counterclockwise. And I went through several different variations of the tubes over the years, and this is sort of the latest one that it's all based on phi ratio, 1 to 1.618, and it creates a braid on a braid as these electrodes spin. So they cause a spin in the plasma, and those spins enfold in together and carry on. And then that plasma field emits outwards into the field around your body and inside of your body, penetrating right into the tissue, because we have a cloud of plasma that we walk around. We call it the aura and all that, but inside of us we also run on plasma all the way down into the center of the cells, and HEP and the mitochondria are running and using charged plasma to create things, and we're doing biological transmutations as well within each cell. And phi ratio is sort of the key to everything in nature, that you can follow that path using phi ratio to go all the way down to the very finite microcosmic things, and all the way out into the macrocosm, and you look at galaxies and everything, and it's all based on this. So the tubes themselves are based on the 72-36 degree angle. That's the shape of the tubes, and in the pentagram is the perfect relationship for phi ratio, and this 108 degrees is the bond angle of water. So bond angle of water, and everybody's heard about structured water and all this, that bond angle between the hydrogens, two hydrogens, the oxygens, capable of moving back and forth 15 degrees in either direction. So you can form very complex geometries in water molecules, and this is what we call structured water. If you get those geometries to hold in the water, you can do some really neat tricks. And Theraphi actually works with the water, and that's another reason why it works so well with your body as well, all the way down to the hydrogen and that. So we've got a new website set up, TheraphiOfficial.com, and Theraphi.tech is Roger's site's been up for some time now, and there's a list of practitioners. You can go and check them out. Then the tubes themselves are, when I first kind of created them, I thought, well, geez, this is a lot like the tubes at Dendera. And so I actually trademarked and adopted the Dendera bulbs as the logo for Theraphi. And interestingly enough, I've played around with a lot of different plasma tubes over the years, and I thought, well, is it possible to create one of these serpents in the tube? And sure enough, they can be made. So this may be very well what the Egyptians were doing. And even down in the bottom half of the tube, this serpent with, like, you can see his head at the top, and then he kind of curves just like the Dendera tubes. And down at the bottom, he has sort of a rattlesnake tail with these nodules on there, and those nodules are solitons. They're waves of compression and rarefaction. So this is a longitudinal wave moving within the plasma to form these solitons at the bottom. And these solitons are a good way to look at these charge clusters, because that's what's happening in this. Plasma is ionizing the gases in there, and it's stripping the electrons off, so you have ions and electrons, and when they're jumping off and on, when they jump back onto the molecules of noble gases that are in there, they release photons. So these photons are also just like longitudinal compressions and rarefactions in the ether. So there's this whole particle wave duality debate, the double slit experiment and all this. It's all waves upon waves upon waves. And we perceive it as particles, and that's fine, because as this waves get more embedded and more embedded, they get denser and denser and denser. And that's why my hand doesn't go through this podium when I bang on it, because those denser waves create this charge field around them, and the charge is being repelled. When I hit this podium, my hand doesn't go right through it, even though there's more space in between the atoms. Like if you look at an atom, an electron's like a pea at one end of a football field, and then you have like a grapefruit at the other end of the football field for the nucleus. So there's just way more space. But what these things have, they're vortices that have combined into these energy densities that provide this field, and they have a charge, and that's what's keeping my hand from going through there. And interestingly enough, when you condense this matter, and condense these waves till they turn to matter, that energy can condense matter further and further. So in the early days, this is one of the tubes I used to make. I put electrodes on the inside, and I had to move away from that because these electrodes were actually turning into something else. They were transmuting into other elements. And the metal, would just get this oily goo and it would dissolve. So Theraphi is capable of doing actual transmutations of the elements. And so I went to these external electrodes and they work quite well. There is some funny things that still happen in that tube. You have to keep metals and everything outside of it because metals are really good conductors, and that's why we don't put metal into the Theraphi field. It accumulates those charge clusters. And the ancients sort of saw this and knew this, and everything is right before your eyes. The solutions to all these problems that we have always been there, and it's been embedded in ancient technologies. And so Theraphi Technology is sort of a really understanding of some of these ancient technologies. So everybody's probably put cream into their coffee cup and you put your spoon in and you get these dual swirls of vortexes, one going clockwise, the other going counterclockwise. That's why the tubes move in this way. The ancients hid this before our very eyes all the time. This is a capital on an ionic pillar, and here it is, the two counter-spinning vortices. So if you were to look at a toroidal field that spins in onto itself, this would be the cross-section of that toroidal field. And this, coincidentally enough, is called an ionic column. And so this idea of ions and stripping the electrons off of the nuclei, then you have a positive ion. The ancient Greeks, had it before ourselves. And Tesla understood so many of these things. And now he said, all the technology I'm working on is for people 100 years from now. Nobody really understands what I'm talking about these days. And if you think about it, he said that 100 years ago. So we're here. We are at the time, right now, when Tesla said, I'm developing these technologies for people 100 years from now. So he knew we were going to put these pieces of the puzzle together. And what Tesla called these type of waves, radiant energy, standing columnar waves. And he did experiments and showed demonstrations like we do with the Theraphi and the fluorescent tube. And when you put the fluorescent tube in between the two tubes of the Theraphi, you can see the longitudinal waves moving through the field. So picture that as your body. They're not connected with any wires at either end. So you're moving this radiant energy is penetrating right through your body and moving in these, what Tesla called these standing waves, standing columnar waves. And the more you can collimate those waves, you can do really interesting things with them. In Theraphi, they get really intense and they can do a lot of very powerful things. They can do transmutations, they can go through objects, they can go through walls, they can go to the other side. And Tesla played with that. Again, another ancient configuration of anti-clockwise and anti-clockwise vortices within ancient technologies, and showing radiant energies and how they move through things. It's continuously embedded in all kinds of ancient hieroglyphs and everything like that. And the reason why they carved things in stones, because the ancients knew that if they wrote it on paper, the paper would be dissolved by now, so we wouldn't be able to learn from the wisdom that they carved in these stones. So they hid all this technology right before us. I don't think this one's going to play, but this shows these standing waves moving in the tube, and they're like pancakes in phi ratio. So there's lots of different configurations that I can manipulate to make the plasma do different things. And when Tesla was able to collimate his waves very finely, he could send them right through your body and expose them onto film, just like the Kirlian photograph. So this is an actual X-ray that Tesla took of his own foot using these standing columnar waves. And his X-ray machine wasn't like our X-ray machines where you got to put that plate right up close to your chest and have this you know, it was Röntgen who created that X-ray tube, that high-powered X-ray tube. But after Tesla was working on these technologies, he just kind of passed it off and said, yeah, it gets pretty crazy, and I don't know if I should be working on this too much because I've kind of mastered it. And Röntgen kind of wrote him a mail and said, wow, I wish I could produce X-rays as good as you. And Tesla basically just stuck his foot in here, had one of his devices about 5 feet away, and could expose the film and took a picture of his foot. And there's a young fellow today, Griffin Brock, who a few years back created his own replication of Theraphi's shadowgraphs, is what he called them, which is basically an X-ray. But these are done with different types of X-rays. These X-rays aren't harmful to your body. They're not giving you cancer. They may very well be treating cancer and making you better. So he experimented with these tubes. He made the Desmotron tube, and he recreated his own replication for the first time since Nikola Tesla did it, because Tesla didn't write a lot about this. He showed a few people, and he wrote a couple small papers referencing it, and there's the references to Röntgen and those guys replicating his work to try and make modern-day X-rays as we know it. So Griffin created Tesla's actual X-ray with his own foot. And he did it from 6 feet away, just like Tesla was doing too. So back in the early 1900s, a lot of people were using Tesla technology to make different types of tubes and different types of electromedical devices, and the violet ray was a very popular one. It came with all these different shapes and sizes for different orifices and things like that. And you could put plasma in there and it would sterilize, kill viruses, bacteria, and do things like that. Today, technology is evolving, so even modern academia and scientists and everything are not dismissing this anymore as crazy talk. And they are really seriously looking into plasma and using it for healing. And one modern adaptation is called cold atmospheric plasma, and that's where they're actually taking the plasma and injecting it atmospherically onto your skin. And the people are calling Theraphi cold atmospheric plasma. That's wrong. It's cold plasma, yes, but it's contained in the tubes. It's under a vacuum. It's not atmospheric. When you have atmospheric plasma, you can create a jet in open air. That's what it means. And so you can expose your skin directly, and it's a non-equilibrium plasma, which means that part of the atoms that are in the gases that would normally be very, very hot are actually cold. And so it can do all kinds of neat skins and penetrate into your skin without doing harm. So I like to go back to the past history. There's a lot of people who made these discoveries that were very important in history, and Michael Faraday is one of them, practical experimenter who had quite an extensive lab, came up with a lot of things about electromagnetism and understanding electromagnetism, and also electrolysis and Brown's gas, HHO. You guys have probably heard of this. Splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, using it as an energy source. Well, let's give credit to where credit's due. We called Yule Brown, or Brown's gas or whatever. It was actually Michael Faraday who was the first to understand that if you had a negative and a positive cathode and an anode from a DC power supply into water, you could create hydrogen and oxygen. And James Clerk Maxwell was a mathematician who wanted to describe mathematically and understand the science, understand a theory, and put together a theory for Faraday's observations in the lab. So he came up, he was a mathematician, and he was an expert in fluid dynamics and aerodynamics. So he applied those fluid dynamic principles to electricity, because electricity flows like fluid and is a really good correlation. So he came up with these 20 equations, they're called quaternions, 20 unknowns and 20 equations. And in there, because this was very complicated math, not like the modern algebra that we have, they abandoned this type of math years ago, and it was Oliver Heaviside, who was part of the modern algebraic formulation of mathematics, who took the quaternions and simplified them into 4 simple equations that we know as Maxwell's equations today. But what he did was he had to chop out. He actually called it murder. I'm going to murder those scalar components out of the math because they're difficult and nobody understands it, and it doesn't make any sense because when you sum things to zero, there's nothing there, so what does it matter? That was the logic behind it. And he actually used the word murder, and he did. But what was really important in this idea of fluid dynamics is he removed this scalar component out of it. And we hear this a lot in technology, in things like devices that people make here, and everybody talks about scalar energy, but nobody knows what it is because you can't measure it because you can't measure scalar energy or whatever. And so people talk about it as like scalar waves and things like that. So tonight we're going to clarify all this, and you guys will be able to understand, hopefully, and know exactly what this mysterious scalar energy is, or scalar waves as it's wrongly called, because it's really a field effect. Then there's Sir William Crookes, who created some of the early plasma tubes that eventually became the CRT tube, cathode ray tube, in your television. Again, these televisions and television radiation, even today with modern screens, we know the radiation's not good for you, so there's ways to make it produce a good radiation from the tubes that is healing, and there's also destructive radiations that our TVs got made into, and even modern LCD screens, and they have certain frequencies that control, or can be used for mind control and things like that. So Tesla basically created a lot of different diagrams and motors and ways of utilizing the energy for good. And he said, electric power is everywhere, present in unlimited quantities, and can drive all the world's machinery without the need for coal, oil, gas, or any other of the common fuels. And this was his dream when he built the Wardenclyffe Tower, was to transmit wireless power using a non-destructive but actually a more coherent healing form of this energy. So life would actually flourish when plants and biological things, people were exposed to these fields. So not only would we be getting the benefits of having wireless electricity everywhere, and you know what a pain it is to hook up your computer and all these devices you have with wires and everything like that, but we would be receiving healing benefits from them as well. And the key to this is using small little tickling of the medium. And this is true for transmutation. This is true for using the healing waves in a proper way. So just like a lightning strike is like one big bang, boom, blows everything up, it's destructive. So the Theraphi is designed to be a constructive type of energy. So it's very soft, it's very feminine, and it utilizes these principles of these small little forces that push, push, push. And we create these toroidal fields in these small pushes, push, push. And then they expand out into the field, and the toroids build into a charge clusters, and they surround your body with this. So it was Irving Langmuir who actually coined the term plasma for what we call plasma today, based on the blood plasma, because they called blood plasma plasma before the electrical phenomenon of plasma, because he said it was like plasma. And the word means that it can fill space and take on shape and form. So he made many different tubes over the years and experimented with that. Walter Russell was another little known person in the field. He was an artist, and he got hit by lightning one day, and he went into a coma, and he had all these visions, and he came out a brilliant guy, and he just started writing about all this esoteric theory, scientific theory on how the models of nature work. And his book, Universal One, I'd highly recommend getting it if you wanted to see what he was doing, because he actually, in his understanding of how the periodic table of the elements moved in phi ratios, predicted elements that we didn't know about that existed. So he said, in the wave lies the secret of all creation, therefore know the wave. And remember, it's all waves upon waves upon waves. Royal Rife was creating RF plasma type devices. His main electrical guy who helped him was Philip Hoyland, And he was using a single plasma tube. And with that single plasma tube, Rife was focused mostly on destructive frequencies. So, it's not all about, people talk about EMF and everything like that. Oh, 60 hertz is bad and all this. This is not really about that. It's more about how clean that signal is, how much noise is on the signal, and how it's radiated. So what Rife was doing was using, and he only had a few frequencies. It wasn't a big, huge list like we see today in like the Spooky 2 and things like that. That became empirical data that we gathered over the years since the 90s. Back in the day, when we found a new frequency that did something somebody had an effect from, we submitted it into that database, and that's how all those frequencies kind of got accumulated. But Rife's original frequencies were designed to destroy viruses and bacteria. And I always wondered, how is it that such a small thing can be affected by such a bigger frequency, because those wavelengths are really huge. But when you start to understand that this forms this cascade of a fractal, because basically the plasma is a perfect fractal antenna, so you can get very small wavelengths of things that have effects on life on a small scale. And Wilhelm Reich knew all about this. He studied and wrote a lot about this type of energy he called orgone. And this was an orgone accumulator that's essentially a capacitor. And he could concentrate these natural energies from the natural surroundings into a box and treat people with them. So we're going to introduce a few new people here that were very important to plasma physics, but very little known, because they did work with Winston Bostick here for military applications and work for the government, and we're consultants for Lawrence Livermore and military applications. And he studied plasmoids. He coined the term plasmoids, and he created these little tiny plasma toroidal fields that folded into themselves and started embedding into each other. So he could shoot two different plasma guns at each other, essentially on a nanoscale, and he observed that these plasmas started to fold into each other. So then he realized that, look, this looks like a microcosmic version of a galaxy. So the articles that came out at that time, which basically disappeared and nobody talked about it over time, because his work and his stuff got all put into military technology. So man creates test tube universe. So he creates a universe in the test tube, and scientists generate the temperature needed to tap into hydrogen power. And so they discovered in the early days, this is in the 50s, 60s, how to create these toroidal fields and pulse them into each other. Then you can take multiple toroids and shoot them at each other, and they form a larger toroid. So these toroids build into bigger toroids, and they have an intense amount of energy in them, and they form just like the cosmos does. And he wrote a lot of papers on it, and he coined this term plasmoid in 1956 by Winston Bostick, and it means a combination of plasma and magnetism. And it's a coherent structure combining a magnetic and plasma thing, because what happens is there's no external magnetic field. These fields fold into themselves, so they have a zero, they can interact on their own and not be influenced by other things, other magnetic fields. So it's emitted as a amorphous blob. So he took the liberty to call it this plasma magnetic entity and called it a plasmoid. And this is this is a dusty plasma, but this is the idea, the structure of the plasmoids all around you. All around your body is a field of these plasmoids, and all through the universe. And as these plasmas interact and they do interesting things, they start to form bigger clusters. They can group together and form bigger clusters. And our whole body, our whole being, our bioenergetic field is made up of these condensed plasmoids, or charge clusters, or exotic exotic vacuum objects, as Ken Shoulders called them. And Bob Greenier is a fellow who's been researching cold fusion, and he's got best name I like to use now is the fractal toroidal moment, because it gives the best sort of description of what these things are. And they're constantly present all around us. They're in all the field. They're inside of us as well. Earlier, like I was saying, inside of our body. So Crookes and Tesla, they called this radiant energy. Wilhelm Reich called it orgone energy and bions. Ken Shoulders called them charge clusters and later exotic vacuum objects. They've also been called, but so many people have discovered these all over the world. And a lot of Russian research has been done on this, more than in America. Even they called them ectons, arizons, the cozy rev, Dirac monopoles, Lochak monopoles. But in everyday life, you all know them, see them every day when you rip your blankets off or take your shirt off, this static electricity. So this static electricity, where is this charge coming from? It's not flowing electricity like current in a wire that's bringing the energy into a light bulb to light it up. So Bob Grenier is a friend and colleague, and he has done years of research into the cold fusion, and he's made this model that is this fractal toroidal moment that understanding what Bostic and all these guys were doing and creating these plasma fields to be such an intense little thing that it'll actually go into matter, rip matter apart, transmute elements, all kinds of different elements on the periodic table into other things, and it can also create energy from matter, and so it can do transmutations, and basically it's essentially cold fusion. It takes all these different elements and combines them together in a fusion process that is not hot, not dangerous. It has some slight radiations to it, depending on the field strength, but it can basically produce energy, and you can create new elements from it. And this is what we've seen over the years, and Bob does a lot of electron scanning microscopes of all kinds of different reactors, cold fusion reactors, and you see these footprints, and these are charge clusters that have blasted into the metal and transmutated, turned different metals into other metals inside of here. So Bob's done a lot of looking at different things like the Hutchison effect. Does everybody know John Hutchison? I've heard of him from Vancouver, where I live. He's sort of this out there kind of independent scientist guy who had this huge laboratory. This is him built in his apartment because he collected old military surplus gear, and he worked on the Navy ships and slowly accumulated all these radios and RF things into this tiny little apartment in Vancouver. And he started doing these experiments and he was taking metal and shredding this metal apart. This is a block of aluminum that just fell apart. It wasn't hot. It wasn't glowing red. He didn't melt it. He just used electromagnetic waves and these charge clusters, not really knowing how or what he was doing, but he was tweaking knobs and doing all these things and developed the theories and did a lot of them. This one here is a block of aluminum that he stuck a bread knife into. He set the aluminum on the block, or set the knife on a block of aluminum and turned on his machine, and the knife sunk into it, displacing the aluminum perfectly. It didn't bulge out or anything like that, kind of like when you put a rock in the water and the water level rises. It didn't rise the aluminum. It just occupied the same time and space. So it's manipulating space-time, and it's manipulating metals. He had levitating objects. He could levitate a cannonball, float up in the air. So there's your anti-gravity, your charge clusters. This was his balcony. He had things equipment hanging from the ceiling to hold up the thing so it wouldn't fall through the floor. Thousands of pounds of equipment in there. So recently, Bob and I did an experiment to actually replicate the Hutchison effect. And so this Hutchison effect's well known. All kinds of military people came. Eventually, John's still going. He lives down in the States now, but his lab in Canada got busted by the authorities, and all kinds of famous people came to see him, William Shatner and all these people, to see his effects. So we were attempting to recreate the Hutchison effect, and we actually used the Theraphi to do this. Because the Theraphi is creating these same kind of charge clusters. And you can use it for healing purposes, like I was saying, but if you do some tweaking, which is a specially modified Theraphi, I call it Octaphi, There's 8 tubes all around here, and we're pumping a lot of RF energy into them. So they're creating these toroidal, fractal toroidal moments in the charge clusters around this table. And this is an old diathermy machine, another obscure electromedical healing device that they banned, and you can't find them anymore. You can only find, if you're lucky to find one of these really old ones from the 50s that run on tubes and that. But we basically put all these different things on the table. There's a block of, John always had radioactive stuff in his experiments because they're providing part of the energy to go into the thing. So we got a block of uranium up here, raw pitch blende. This is a radium glass bowl. There's zinc, lead, iron, brass, all kinds of different metals, a cup of ice cream, and a few gnomes and mushrooms in there for good luck. And we ran this experiment for like 4 hours and did a live broadcast on YouTube all night long. And we didn't get anything to levitate or to break apart or anything like that until after the experiment. After we finished the video, shut everything off, and Bob went to fix one of the zippers. He said, "Oh, you got a pair of pliers?" And I picked up a pair of pliers that wasn't on the table, wasn't in the hotspot. The difficulty is to keep that area, that zone controlled wherever it goes, because you don't know where the field is. We pick up this pair of pliers, and he goes to squeeze it to do this little zipper thing on a zipper to tighten that little clamp, and the handle snapped off like that. So whether this got affected by the experiment or not, we're not sure. It's up in the air. But that's the kind of things that happens with the Hutchinson effect. And so this year, or last year, I guess, in September, we did our Alchemy of Prague for the first time in years. And in a second part of the Alchemy of Prague, we actually did a demonstration with all of these people here on 5 different ways to do cold fusion in your kitchen, basically. Doing transmutations, producing over unity energy, and showed all these guys, basically how simple it really is. Before that, we did the spagyric class in the Edward Kelly's Tower that we usually do every couple of years or so. So that was a lot of fun. So this stuff is sort of what the alchemists were doing, using all this kind of energetic techniques before there was the modern day technologies for using electrical devices and things like that. But creating these charges, and what's important to know is that these 4 different states of matter, solid, liquids, gases, and plasma, and they call plasma the 4th state of matter, but it's kind of like an Ouroboros that swallows its tail and it goes around and around, because the plasma can take everything apart and then rebuild it and become the 1st state of matter, because all things are created from plasma. And there's this story, part of the secret to all this, and this has been heavily suppressed as well, is this phenomenon of ball lightning. Ball lightning is a giant one of these charge clusters, and it has a lot of power, a lot of energy, and it has some very strange phenomena that it does, like it can float down your chimney and come into your bedroom, like some of these old wood picks, wooden diagrams of it happening. And there's stories of, the old lady, she's cleaning in her kitchen, and one of these ball lightnings bounces in, and she picks up her broom and starts sweeping it. Get out, get out, get out, and the ball bounces across the floor and goes out through the door. Not opening the door, it goes through the door and out the other side. These things can go through glass, they can go through metal, they can literally go right through this. Like I was saying, my hand won't go through this podium, ball lightning will. It'll rip right through and won't harm this wood at all, won't even burn it, won't touch it. It happens in airplanes where it comes in the front of the plane, bounces down the aisle, and goes out the tail of the plane while flying in midair without affecting the plane at all. So this sort of ball lightning phenomena has been talked about for years, but mostly in the West, modern science, they all like, oh no, it's just a wives' tale, don't look there, it's got nothing to do with anything. And this is a Russian researcher who was after Benjamin Franklin, put his kite up with the key and the string. Don't do this inside. Don't do this at home at all, kids, but definitely don't do it inside, because that's what he did. He put his kite out the window and he brought it down trying to replicate George Washington's experiment, and ball lightning formed at the end of the string down on the floor, and boof, hit him in the head. He's one of the first people to die in an electrical experiment. So it didn't end too well for him. So these things are highly dangerous. They can be so powerful that they can kill you. They can rip things apart and destroy things, but they can be made in the lab. Christian Birkeland is somebody I've talked about a lot over the years. He did this Toroidal experiment where he emulated these plasmas inside of a controlled chamber. And see how we're doing for time. Yeah. So Christian Birkeland was sort of a experimental physicist who did these things, and he talked a lot about the upper atmosphere and the northern lights and the aurora, and how this is a huge charge clusters coming in from the sun, and tons of energy are being beamed into this Earth all the time. And we have this Van Allen belt around the Earth that kind of protects us from that. But he did expeditions to the North Pole and did a lot of this early work on plasma research. And people in his day, they all said he was crazy, that there's no, nothing to do with electricity or anything like that. Again, it was just modern science's way. Science changes one funeral at a time, as the saying goes. So people get stuck in their theories and their ideas and their concepts. And what these concepts are doing today in our modern way of discovering is it throws everything out the window. I mean, all these laws, everything gets defied. Laws of thermodynamics, all these kind of things get defied by these exotic vacuum objects, these plasmoids. And this is what's coming from the sun. This is also part of why the Earth is being, all the life force comes from the sun through our little galaxy, and this goes in a fractal chain from the center of the universe to the center of the sun to the center of the Earth. These energies manifest through the sky. We see them, especially in these latest solar storms. We've seen them all the way. I don't know if you guys seen them here in California, but I know they saw them in Florida and North Carolina and things like that. So usually you see them up north in the North Pole, and that a lot clearer because that's where they're continuously bombarding. But this is how the Theraphi works. It's also how the Earth works. Is it has two opposite spinning polar fields, the North Pole and the South Pole, and these energies come into the Earth in this way and sustain all this life. So these things can travel, bring information and energy all throughout the cosmos, and they form these light tubes. And these light tubes are plasma filaments that, just like Winston Bostick was forming these rotating fields in there, they have a magnetic field, and they form two poles. They form like a positive and a negative, and they twist around each other, so they braid. So this is why the Theraphi electrodes braid, to cause that twist in the plasma. And as they do, they create these long filaments, and these filaments are the light tubes that connect everything in the universe together. All the stars are connected through every point of light that you see in the sky is like a filament of these light tubes coming to your eyes. And we are designed to absorb that energy and be part of it. And that's where the astrological influence comes from, being born at certain times and your imprints that come from the positions of the stars and the planets when you're born, because everything is connected. All these things are connected in this way, and they're all connected through plasma, and it's an information highway. It's sort of like the mycelium in the ground, because it looks a lot like, I don't know if I have one, but the same, as you zoom out on the cosmos, it's just like mycelia that you would see that connect the mushrooms, and everything in living in the forest and everything's all connected through the mycelia. So this plasma connection through the cosmos is the information highway, just as the mycelia are forming in exactly the same way, because it's all fractal and it's recursive. And they're using the same kind of plasma energy to form their fields and their filaments to move through the Earth. So this plasma fields go right into the Earth and can be formed as well into the center of the Earth, and they get reflected back out. And this is an alchemical concept. This is also what Tesla was doing with the Wardenclyffe Tower. That's how he was bringing that energy from a scalar, basically he was phase conjugating the sky and the Earth together and bouncing the signal into the Earth and pulling on the telluric currents and all the energetics happening from the center of the Earth to bounce back up to the top of the tower to transmit this radiant energy to create wireless power. And we see even DNA is another fractal reflection of the same thing, because those filaments form exactly the same way that DNA does. And Glenn Ryan's going to do, on my talk on Sunday, he's going to come and explain how the Theraphi interlocks with the DNA, and he's shown in the lab that it increases the toroidal moment, because the toroid gets formed from these spinning filaments. So you picture a piece of DNA that's like 2 or 3 meters long, single strand of DNA if you were to stretch it all about. And then it coils and winds and winds and winds on itself, and it winds up, winds up, winds up, till it gets into these knots, and then it goes around and touches in on itself. Boom, becomes a toroid. Then it has all the energy and everything locked into it, and it has an incredible amount of potential. And that's the way all life form gets communication through these toroids. So the DNA itself is a fractal toroidal antenna, and capable of passing multiple wavelengths through it in this way, because it's braided into itself over and over again. So we see these coronal mass ejections from the sun come out in these same spiral filaments. Again, the aurora borealis, how it connects with the DNA. And the information moves down that DNA or moves through the air, like my voice resonating in the air. This is a longitudinal wave that you're hearing the sound of my voice with the vibration of your eardrums coming from a longitudinal wave created from my voice. This is the type of electricity that Tesla was calling this radiant energy. This is what the Theraphi really is this longitudinal waves that's moving through the tube that you saw, as opposed to regular electromagnetic waves that we use for radio and communicating, and our 60 hertz cycle that is providing our light in that. So these kind of waves interface with higher dimensions and more etheric, and they have more power and more information that you can pack into them, and they can do a lot more amazing things, because they're standard electromagnetic waves that are created from the voltage and the magnetic component, the B field. So we call it the E field is the electrical side of it. It moves up and down like this, and the magnetic field moves at 90 degrees to the side of it. That's the B field. And it propagates in a direction, and then that's a vector. So what we're going to lead up to here is starting to understand, okay, what is this scalar phenomenon? So well, I'm not going to get too heavy into the math or anything like that, but the important concepts to note is that you have a magnetic field and you have an electric field. And together they have a vector of propagation, so if the current is running down the wire, it's running this way. And it's really, again, waves upon waves upon waves, so it's a moving spiral. If you look at the reflection of it on a 90-degree axis, you see the wave for the magnetic field and a wave for the electric field. But the important thing to realize is that it's moving in a spiral, and everything is always moving in a spiral. Everything in nature moves in spirals and vortexes. And then we have what's called potential. So when you have a car battery, you have a positive on one side and a negative on the other. Potential, there's no current moving when it's not connected to anything. So there's nothing moving down a wire to light up a light bulb or anything like that. You just have what's called potential. So it's got 12 volts potential, which means it can do something if it were to move. But it's not. So what that actually is, and we have to go back to this understanding of the ether. Tesla and Crookes and Maxwell and those guys, they called it the medium. So the medium is essentially the ether. And so it's like a change in a differential in a positive and a negative, or a surplus and a deficiency of the energetic qualities of the ether. So you look at a battery as being sort of a vacuum, a lack of potential on one side and a more of something on another that distorts the field around it, which is the ether. And this energetic qualities is how everything communicates through the universe. And when these things get together and current starts to move from the potential through a gradient from one side to another, it causes a magnetic field, and those magnetic fields like to attach to each other. So as long as you have a north and a south, they're going to stick together, and you have two norths, they're going to repel each other. So that's how these plasma filaments kind of work. And they end up forming into very complicated braids. They start to form these toroidal spins. And you could look at this on a very small scale. So each one of these little rings in this string is a toroid. And then the toroid, you remember the counterclockwise and the clockwise? And the toroids start to twist up. Just the DNA does exactly the same thing. So these braids start to twist and twist and twist and twist and become these filaments. And when you have it and it folds back in on itself, it becomes this toroidal shape where the E fields and the B fields work out to be zero because it's folding in on itself. And so as that spiral goes to continue, you can put a magnet next to one of these things and it doesn't affect it, it doesn't move, where it would if it was in a straight line. So these toroids can easily be seen in something like an air cannon. You've seen those air bazookas where people shoot the smoke ring through the air, or just blowing a smoke ring. That's a toroidal field that starts off with a braid on itself, and it starts to braid into itself and continues to travel through the air. And it's self-sustained, and it moves on 3 axes as a spin. So it spins this way, it spins this way, and it can spin forward in the forward motion. And that can happen at a very small scale, like these charge clusters that we're talking about that forms the fields around your body with the Theraphi. And it can happen on a very large scale, on a cosmic scale. And it also happens in a charge collapse from a sphere. So if you have a ball, like the Earth, let's say, and you've got a North Pole and the South Pole on it, if the Earth started to collapse in on itself and that North Pole came down and fell through the Earth, you end up with what's called a magnetic monopole. And so these monopoles were theorized by physicists for a long time, and only recently have we discovered, oh yeah, they may actually exist. Well, these fractal toroidal moments are these magnetic monopoles. And this has been seen in work from ultrasonic cavitation. When you have an ultrasonic cleaner and you have very fast moving piezoelectric kind of transducer that translates electrical frequency into a pressure wave, like a longitudinal wave, into a medium like water, and you have your jewelry in there and you use your ultrasonic cleaner and it blows all the dirt off your jewelry with these little pulses, right? If those pulses get strong enough, they can create this bubble, and then the bubble can collapse into a fractal toroidal moment, and it gains momentum, and it starts sucking in hydrogen ions and atoms around it and whatever else is in the water, and it can form this re-entry jet. So it's kind of like, the best way to look at this is like your propeller on a boat. You know how you have a boat and you get that propeller on the back, and your propeller gets eaten up with all this little divots and holes and stuff, and they say, oh yeah, it's from the cavitation of the bubbles. Well, how is that metal getting completely dissolved from a bubble in water? Well, it's because it's moving really fast. Well, actually, it's creating such a huge amount of force when it hits this re-entry jet. When that hits the surface, that re-entry jet can do cold fusion, and it can take elements on the periodic table and change them into other things. It rip them apart and turn them into pure energy. That's why you see in sonoluminescence, when you see that little bubble inside of a flask where they create 2 phase conjugated transducers, and you put them 180 degrees out of phase, you get a little bubble moving in the center of a flask at Mach 10, and the surface area is harder than the surface of the sun. So now we see that the spherical shape and how it relates to the toroid, and then you see this all throughout the cosmos on the grand scale, massive toroidal cosmic, with a black hole at the center that's spitting out, pure ions, pure out one side, and electrons out the other. So it's separating the charges of elements and spewing them out and creating elements as they move away from the center. And this is what the sun's doing too. And the elements are created on their way to the Earth, and they're coming into the Earth, and the Earth is expanding. It's not that it was like Pangea and the Earth used to be, so there's this expanding Earth idea where some modern science tells you, oh yeah, all the planets were, or all the continents were stuck together on one side of the globe and it was all water. Well, the globe would probably start rotating kind of funny if it did do that. But then the planets split apart, or the continents split apart, and they became all the different continents around the world. But what's actually happened is the Earth is like a seed, like a crystal, and it's growing, and it's continuously growing and gaining. That's why time changes. From ancient times, we got more hours and longer hours in the day, things like that. So there's a book by Robert Temple that came out a year or two ago, and he kind of put all the pieces of the puzzle together. All the people that I've studied over the years, he conglomerated all the papers and tied together all these plasma physics concepts into understanding what he calls the new science of heaven. And that's actually understanding plasma and what it is, because we've all heard that the universe is 99.999% plasma. So what that ultimately means is that matter is just 0.0001% of what exists in the universe. So all our science is based on 0.001% of reality. So we think we're so great, but we got no idea of all this. So what he's saying in this book, and he's bringing together papers that are showing, hey, these plasmas, we need to move from a plasma or from a matter-centric kind of concept, because all our Newtonian physics and all our quantum mechanics and everything and all our theories are based on this very rare phenomenon. So we got to move to a plasma-centric understanding of the universe. And when we do this, then everybody here that knows about all these other kind of outside realms and things like that, it all makes sense. All the science comes together to show you that this gives us insight into maintaining negative entropy in all biological systems. It's the key to understanding consciousness, memory, dreams, astral travel, Akashic records, psychokinesis, telepathy, the soul, how your soul works, angels, demons, ghosts, heavens, all explained by understanding plasma and the plasma phenomenon. This is a Journal of Physics article about even dense plasmas that can form crystalline forms, and how plasmas are just like life forms because they do the same things we do. They eat, they breed, they multiply, they do all these things. So they call them complex plasmas. Complex plasmas may naturally self-organize themselves into stable, interacting helical structures that exhibit features normally attributed to organic, living matter. So it's concluded by this paper that a complex of self-organized plasma structures exhibit all the necessary properties to qualify them as candidates for inorganic living matter that may exist in space, provided certain conditions to allow them to evolve naturally. So in this book, Robert Temple talks about this Kordylewski cloud that's in between us and the moon. And it's a giant plasma cloud. So essentially you can look at this concept of heaven, because we are all essentially, we're light beings, right? Everybody kind of gets that from our understanding like that. And this is how you explain scientifically that we are light beings, and how we have a soul, and how there is a heaven, and how we can go into these other places and other dimensions, because it exists in a plasma domain, not in a physical solid domain that we are, because this is a rarity. So these plasmas can also become super dense and become hard like crystals. And this kind of reminds me of the Two-Eye Stone in Atlantis. Another legendary story where in Atlantis they ran all their ships and their everybody had free energy and everything all came from a solid state plasma solid crystal that they called the Two-Eyed Stone. I'm going backwards. So this is why it's important in our conscious evolutionary state that we don't make the same mistake that we made in Atlantis, because in Atlantis there was two groups, the Belial group, this according to Edgar Cayce, and the Amelius group. And they, one group got out of hand. One group wanted to use the energy for positive healing sides. The other one was like, you know what, we could blow stuff up with it and we can make more power. Let's crank it up and destroy people with it. And that's what ended up happening. And that's why the Atlantis fell, basically. So Ken Shoulders is another really important one. He's the one that coined the term the exotic vacuum objects to understand how these fractal toroidal moments and the amount of power and the amount of energy in them. Ken was the first to work with them after Winston Bostick and make them into more practical things. And he could shoot these things out like a cannon. He called them charge clusters. Later he called them exotic vacuum objects. But he basically said how they fold into themselves and how they become these clusters of either positive or negatively charged clusters, how they could carry ions with them, and how they could shoot into metals and go right through a metal and out the other side, just like the ball lightning, because essentially this is what it is like a little microcluster of ball lightning, and how these leave tracks and the imprints like we saw earlier in the Hutchison examples. So Ken Shoulders did a lot of work with that. And going back to understanding how these charge clusters can be used in the anti-gravity sense, so that's where we saw all the transmutation and all those kind of things, the healing effects from them, how could they be used in propulsion or anti-gravity type effects, because you can build these charge clusters to do that as well. And T. Townsend Brown was a fellow who worked for the US Navy. He's a more recent fellow, but he created all kinds of electromagnetic systems that worked with the gravitational fields. And he learned this, again, from a tube, an X-ray tube, like one of those old Crookes tubes. And he noticed when he had the X-ray tube on the bench and he put a hard charge dumped a lot of current into it, it moved just slightly in one direction on the bench. And he said, oh, that's weird, because there should be no mass in electrons. There shouldn't be anything that makes this thing move. And that led him into discovering what they call the Byfield-Brown effect. And the fact is that the electromagnetic force is 10 to the 39 times stronger than gravitational force. So this is how we can use electricity to overcome gravity. Right now we're making jet fuel and diesel fuel and all these things, and we're flying these things. Even the idea of like NASA and now SpaceX and this concept of blasting these rockets into the air with billions of loads of fuel. By the way, greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions and things like that. Every one of those thing of rocket blasts going up into space is like more than all the cars on Earth running for a year each time you do that. The biggest CO2 emissions, to be clear on this, of anybody on this planet is the military-industrial complex, and they've done the most damage to not only environmental but also interdimensional and things like that. Every time you blast off a nuclear bomb, and that's another reason why the extraterrestrials are kind of pissed. They're just like, hey, every time you guys blow one of these off, it echoes into our realm here. You got to watch out for this. So T. Townsend Brown experimented with all this electrical phenomena and moving things with propulsion, and patented a lot of these systems, and using what we call electrogravitics. And that's where you can just separate the charge to make things move along in space. And that all was part of secret programs that later got adopted into military technology. So the B-2 stealth bomber is basically a $2.3 billion flying capacitor, because that's essentially how it works, is what T. Townsend Brown discovered, and probably people before him. There was quite a group of fraction of German scientists that understood this. That's where we got the American rocket program and everything like that after World War II and Project Paperclip. We got our pick of the German scientists that were into this. They were making the Nazi Bell. They had flying craft. And the reason why the Navy is a big part of spaceships and being terrestrial kind of spaceships and things like that is because you could easily convert a submarine to go into space. So it had a pressure vessel that was capable of withstanding the vacuum of space. So the Navy was always part of the what we call secret space program. Now we're part of the military-industrial complex that went into space and built spacecraft and things like this. And it's all based on this same concepts as what the Theraphi is doing, as these micro charge clusters are doing, these exotic vacuum objects, or the fractal toroidal moment. These are all words for ways of creating these toroidal fields. And they can be very small, like I was saying, and shooting like Ken Shoulders is doing to do transmutations, but you can scale it up. And when you scale it up, it has a lot more force, and it'll actually cancel, well, it doesn't cancel gravity out, but it creates its own gravitational field, and then you can manipulate that gravitational field and create like a gravity well and move it. T. Townsend Brown, very mysterious fellow. His daughter had put a lot of his works on their websites up today. And Paul Shatskin has wrote this great book called The Man Who Mastered Gravity about T. Townsend Brown, and he wrote a second one about Farnsworth and the Farnsworth fusor, which is another cold fusion device by Farnsworth, who invented the modern day version of the TV tube, and how he took a crux tube and created lines that scan down to provide a picture on your television set. He also had a cold fusion device that just kind of got swept away. So the scalar field. So now how do we explain the scalar things? Because it was kind of popularized by Tom Bearden back in the 90s, early 2000s. He talked a lot about it. And basically, he was lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He taught a nuclear physics program. He was electrical engineer, and he started explaining about, he passed away a few years back, unfortunately. What a lot of people don't know about Tom was that he was like a old-time country musician, and yeah, so this scalar concept, because that's what he talked about, phase conjugation and scalar waves, which we can't say scalar waves. It's a better way to look at it, scalar is as a field. All a scalar means is it only has one component to it. It doesn't have a direction, or it's only one thing. So like 10 or 5, the number 5, those are all scalars. So just a number. So if you were to travel, a distance is a scalar, 3.2 miles. Now if it was 3.2 miles an hour, that adds 2 components to it. So if you only have one component to it, and you don't have like a vector, you just have a scalar. So weight is a scalar, temperature is a scalar, distance is a scalar, just a single number. And the reason why it's more properly said as a scalar field, because you can have a distribution of like heat. Let's take temperature as a scale in this room. There's different temperatures all over this room, so there's a scalar field of temperature, and you look at it on a map like that. That's a scalar field in the temperature domain. Now, we talked about the magnetic field and the electric field. That's what makes up electromagnetism. They're like two sides of the same coin. And you have a B field and an E field. That's your electromagnetism. But there's a third force, this gravitational force, which we say in modern science today, oh, we know nothing about gravity, how it works. Nobody knows. You know, Isaac Newton came up with the laws of gravity and stuff like that. We've got laws for how fast things fall and how they move. But how it works, we don't know. Nobody knows. Big mystery. What there is, there's an underlying potential, underlying force behind it all. So when you go into electromagnetic theory, there's a right-hand rule, lines of force. That's what we saw with the magnetic field and the electric field, the E field and the B field at 90 degrees out of phase, and force moving this way. And the standard model of physics, we've done a lot of amazing things, and we understand all these subatomic particles, and we did a really good job of putting it all together and understanding how things connect to each other that make up bosons and all these gluons, things that hold the strong nuclear force that holds the protons together, and weak nuclear force. So we call these things the 4 fundamental forces. So the standard model of particle physics is scientists' current best theory to describe the most basic building blocks of the universe. The standard model explains 3 of the 4 fundamental forces that govern the universe: electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force. And then they get into a bunch of stuff about light and all these kind of things, but there's a lot of shadiness and misunderstanding, because in this kind of physics you can do what they call math magics, where you can make the mathematics explain what you want to explain. But the 4th fundamental force is gravity. And it's not adequately explained by the standard model at all. So there's a real missing part of this. And this is the missing part. It's the underlying force or potential that manipulates these 3 things. So you have the magnetic vector potential, the electric scalar potential, and the gravitational scalar potential, and the underlying scalar superpotential, if you want to call it. That is what the perturbation is that makes those 3 things all work. And if you understand how to manipulate and do the math for that, then you get into really cool things. That's when you start manipulating gravity, and you can manipulate time itself. So this is the mathematics that Oliver Heaviside wrote out of Maxwell's equations, and it's been kept secret for a long time. In the highest levels of these secret space programs, and even in the more common, Martin Lougheed and Skunk Works and all these groups, they understand this mathematics in order to make a lot of these anti-gravity things. Salvador Paez has patented for the U.S. Navy free energy type devices, anti-gravity type devices. He calls it the superforce. And the superforce, this underlying force that can manipulate all the other things, is kind of what will tie together the Einsteinian theory of relativity that works on a macrocosmic scale, and quantum mechanics that works on a microcosmic scale. The underlying superforce, the scalar potential, is what will unify these fields to give us a full understanding of unified fields. And when we do, we'll understand not only how time works, the Big Bang. Again, they have this in there, but there's a big question mark, because the Big Bang is more on a religious concept in science than it is based on fact. But so when we can do this, we'll manipulate gravity. We can have these flying crafts. Many of them have been drawn up, patented, and explained to some degree, but nobody really understands, because you really have to understand these underlying forces in order to make it work. So Tom Bearden wrote this book, Gravidobiology, and in here he says, this provides a breakthrough in the understanding of the mechanisms of the direct biological effects of Maxwellian electromagnetics. However, one is given great pause at the sobering implication for both good and evil, because you can use these scalar things to make either powerful healing machines, like what the Theraphi is, or you can turn it into very dangerous weapons that can just dissolve a person, right before your eyes, or matter, or things. Or you can do all kinds of things like creating illusions in the air. Like you can make a plane that's actually in the air invisible, but you could also make a plane visible that's not really there. You can do all kinds of really cool tricks like that with it. So Tom Bearden talked a lot about that. He's the one that kind of popularized that. And when we understand this underlying scalar force, then we realize how we tap this 0-point vacuum. That's where the infinite energy is. It's where all energy comes from. Energy is just created, so it doesn't. The hydroelectric dam is churning with a magnetic generator, and the water is falling and moving it. Well, where's the energy coming from? It's not the magnetic field moving through the wires. That's how it happens. But where is it really the real source? The real source, it comes from the quantum vacuum. And where does it go when it runs into your light bulb and you paid for it, and then it goes out as light and then disappears, and then what? Where is it gone? It's not created or destroyed or whatever. It goes back to the vacuum is where it goes. So everything comes from there and everything goes to there. And the thing about us, that the biggest secret that they really don't want you to know, is that we're fully capable of doing all these things ourselves, because we have this, these 2 hemispheres of our brain And we can create these fractal toroidal moments with our own thoughts and our things. So we can do all the healing. We can do all this stuff. When we can manipulate time and space, and just like all the stories of the yogis that can float in the air and levitate, or push their hand into the rock wall and leave a handprint in the wall. We have that potential because we are plasma light beings, basically.
Your next lecture
Yeah.
with that subject.
Yes, okay. Yeah, then I might not have lost some of the people, but I really wanted to get this understood, because it's been a pet peeve of mine all this time, because there's been people, talk about the scalar this and scalar that without really understanding it. And this is what it really is and what it really means, and the potential. So thank you for all hanging in there. I know it was intense, but thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
What do you know with CERN?
CERN, well, this is the same thing. So when we're creating such a huge, again, it's all done electromagnetically, so they've created this big loop of really strong, powerful electromagnets. And what they do is smash particles into each other. So they'll just take, a single proton and launch it down this thing and hit it with another proton coming in the opposite direction. And they see it blow into other things. It's really waves that they're breaking apart, but they look at it as particles. So they're looking for the God particle. And every time they smash two things together that we would call matter, it makes more matter and it makes more smaller things. The standard model and all those things are the things they found that make up matter, but they look at it as all billiard balls. It's not. It's waves that are entangled through these fractal toroidal movements to hold on to themselves. So they can smash off in a lot of different parts. And so, yeah, that's the best I could explain it, I guess.
So does the Theraphi generate scalar energy?
Yes. So this is essentially what's happening. Yeah, 100%. And the reason why is because of that phase conjugation where it cancels each other out. Just like Tom Bearden showed, when you have two phases and you have a plus 10 and a minus 10, the two tubes are completely opposite. They're spinning in opposite direction. Tom also said that's the way to maximize your scalar potential, is to cause the twists. You got to have the vortices, got to be twisting in the ether. So you got the ether spinning and twisting clockwise and spinning and twisting clockwise. That alone creates a scalar potential. But when those two phases cancel each other out, using that spintronics or torsion field as well, then you got a twisted torsion that's canceled each other out both in space and in time, with the waves, the longitudinal waves that are coming in that meet each other, just like you saw in the tube. When they're right in the middle, they go into zero. So the E field and the B field's canceled. And then that's the scalar field that's generated around it.
So this is the only device on the market that has scalar and plasma that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
This is an important distinction.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of the scalar pendants and all that, I mean, it's easy to say scalar because you can look at it, like I said, like there's a scalar temperature gradient in this room. So a lot of things are scalar, but to understand the scalar in the way that we're talking about it to create a healing modality, because when that charge collapse happens into that scalar thing, that's when the time reversal part comes into it. Because if you're feeding in an input and the four-wave mixing and you're feeding in an input frequency, you'll get the reverse reflection of it back out from that scalar collapse. So that's how that part works in it.
This med stuff is legit?
Well, here's the deal. It's kind of like hopium. There's this part of this disinformation thing, and the part of the thing that you have to be careful about is that disinformation's always been used in the UFO community to keep people, to mix up the truth with fiction and put a lot of fiction into the story so no one ever discovers the truth. Well, it's crept over into the electromedical or the alternative healing side of things too. So, I mean, the whole thing about the QAnon and all that, in my opinion, that's all just deception to keep people from finding the real truth. And I think that what's happening now, and the story was as soon as Trump got in, boom, every hospital was going to have a med bed and they're all going to be up, That kind of thing you really have to stray away from. And unless somebody can explain to you the real science and what they're really talking about in plain, simple ways, they're basically baffling you with bullshit. So That's the one thing that you have to be aware of. Now that you can use these tools to educate yourself, where you question them, you say, oh yeah, and exactly how does that work? And if they can't answer it, they don't know what they're talking about, and they're just rambling off big words to make them sound fancy. Okay.